right. Welcome back to Finding the Balance with me, Chase, your host and producer. I produce everything from the graphic to the music, even all that stuff. I do it all by myself. The music could probably be a little bit better in quality, and I complain about that all the time, and I know I gotta get it fixed, but I took that intro song from an old song I started but never finished, and I was just looking for some intro music, and I don't want to use one of those corny sort of clips you find on the internet, just this little stupid little electro music thing. I don't know why. I just hate those things. I think they're just so generic, so bland and boring. I wanted to do something sort of my own thing. So nobody ever really does, like, sort of the heavy metal thing, and I'm into heavy metal. I love listening to metal. And so I figured, and I also did want to use something. Like, I had a bunch of ideas for different other songs that I listened to use. I was like, oh, that song would sound awesome on it, but there's a copyright issue and I don't really want to deal with. So I was like, I'll just do my own. And I'm like, well, what song do I have that could work? And it was this incomplete song I started a while ago with old sort of production knowledge that I've improved on. But anyways, there you go. All right, so my throat is a little bit dry right now, so I'm going to try to just work through that with this one. I apologize for that. But yeah, what I want to do with this, and probably the next several Finding the Balance segments, podcasts, whatever you want to call this, is something that I haven't really done before. And I was thinking about this for a while because, first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go through a book, sort of, chapter by chapter. And it's a book that is really, it's just one of those books that's just, man, my hair is really important to me. It's had a really big impact on my life from an author who's had a big impact on my life and my thinking. I don't really read this author much anymore, C.S. Lewis, not as much as I used to when I first was taking my baby steps as a Christian. But I still appreciate and enjoy going back. It just kind of takes me back to those early days, And the book, of course, is the Screwtape Letters. The Screwtape Letters is probably C.S. Lewis's, next to Mere Christianity, his most well-known, his most famous work, and it is a very unique piece of work. And we'll find out why here in a moment, but it's a book that over the years, has become something just has a place in my heart, I guess. I always just love listening to the audiobook version. It's just kind of relaxing. I never get tired of it. It just kind of never really gets boring. It's just always fascinating to listen to. And I've always believed, and the more and more I read the book, that man, just Christians, they really need to read this book. I don't care what you believe about, your particular theological disagreements with the C.S. Lewis are. This is a book that you should read. You should really read this book. And by the way, let me just say here, I come from a Reformed perspective. As you can see, my shirt here, Reformation. I'm a big fan of the Reformation. And it has I bought this in 2017 for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. It has, Soli Deo Gloria, Sola. It's got all five of the solas right there. So yeah, I take a Reformed perspective, and I'm not ashamed of that. And so because of that, I realize I disagree with C.S. Lewis on several things. Things I wasn't thinking about, by the way, when I was reading him. I wasn't thinking about any of this stuff. But nevertheless, again, I'm not one of these uber reformed guys who just like anybody who's not reformed I never listen to or I never read. I can still appreciate works from people that I would disagree with. And C.S. Lewis is definitely one of those authors. I think every Christian, whatever your denominational background is, you should read this book. It's really, really good. And kind of like I said in my sort of announcement, it's a book it's satirical in nature, a brilliant kind of satire. But at the same time, it also has lots of warnings for us, things that we need to be careful about as Christians. Now, the other reason I wanted to do this is because the news lately, for me at least, has been incredibly depressing. It's just, like some of the most popular podcasts. My personal favorite podcasts. I want to say popular. They're not really popular, but my favorite podcasts that do news. I haven't even been listening to them lately because it's just so overwhelming, all of this stuff. And I can sense in a lot of these guys who do this stuff for a living, I can sense they're just getting super depressed. And I'm thinking to myself, man, I need a break from this. I really do. This stuff is just. I haven't been on social media as much as normal. That's something I'm going to talk about here in a second. But it's just very, very depressing, overwhelming. And I think we need to just shut it off for a little bit, maybe for a couple of days. That's what I intend to do. I tend to just shut down on the news for a couple of days and try to get my sort of recalibrate, you could say, just kind of take some time to think, reflect, slow down a little bit. These things I always tell people that way they should do, and I'm not doing it. So it's something I really, really, really need to do. And I want to encourage others to do it as well. And I thought this would be a cool way to do that. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to periodically through these episodes, however long they take, probably not going to be too long. This one's the introduction here is probably going to be a little lengthy because I'm introducing, and I also still want to get into the first letter. I don't want to do like an introduction and then not get into the first letter. I think that's letting my audience down a little bit. You came here to do a thing on Screwtape Letters, and the very first episode you're looking forward to, and then I don't do it. It's just like that's a little disappointment. So I don't want to do that. So, by the way, it's my protein shakes. I drink those especially when I'm not eating much for dinner. Help me get a proper amount of calorie intake for each day. I'm not a heavy eater. I don't eat a whole lot, to be honest with you. So these kind of help with that. They're a really easy way to just take in a lot of calories. So anyways, I will take a drink from this every so often until I run out, of course. So there's that. And then the other thing is social media. So I really do believe that Christians, because I see a lot of posts from Christians going through a lot of depression, and I do too. I go through a lot of depression. I'm not excluding myself. And I remember talking to my mom about this once, and she's like, "What's up with all these millennials and just so much depression everywhere?" And I thought, yeah, it really is, and I think there's a problem. It is kind of a problem. I mean, I don't know if it's unique to us. Maybe people from her generation went through it as well. I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if I found out that it was unique to us, millennials, and then the Gen Z, or Gen X, whatever. I don't care. The dumb kids coming up behind me. See how pessimistic I am now because of the news and stuff? It's just but I think a part of that has to do with social media. There's something about the constant just doing this, constantly doing that I think is there's something about dopamine in our brains. It's released constantly whenever we receive new information. And I think what has really happened, I honestly think, the intake of all that information so fast and just constant has become a drug. It really is a drug. And we're just getting our fix constantly when we're doing this. And you can test this theory. Try to do something productive, like write. What I do a lot of writing. Write or read your Bible. Sure, do that too. Do some studying, do some reading, and try to do that for like an hour without touching your phone and going to social media. I don't know about you, but I find that hard to do. After about maybe 10 minutes, I want to just put the book down, what I'm reading or whatever I'm writing, kind of drop it for a moment, and then go straight to and see what's going on social media. Like it's and it takes a lot out of me to just actually resist that. It's a drug. I mean, it's become a drug, and I think there's something about it that's messing with our heads, and it's depressing. That's all I can come up with. I'm not exactly sure all the details about it, but that's my theory. So I think I'm really starting to think it's a good idea for all of us to take periodic breaks from social media. All of it, not just Facebook or not just Twitter, especially Twitter. I'm not even on Twitter. I'm not going to go there. Pretty sure I wouldn't be welcome on Twitter anyway. So, but even Parler, I gotta just shut it all off for a while. Just I think I'm gonna take another Facebook break here pretty soon. Probably only pop up just to post another episode here, and then just run away. All that stuff. So I think that's part of it too. But going back to the political thing here, as we get started here, I want you. This isn't going to be for you to take, and when we talk about, he's going to talk about certain things here, and I think there's a tendency on our part to go, oh, I know an example of this. It's that guy or that person in politics right over there and all this stuff and blah, 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 this person on Facebook and stuff. Now, granted, you could make application to some of these things that you read in the book to other people, but I want you to try and do that a lot less. I want you to take these things, because I'm certain C.S. Lewis didn't write this so that you can read this and then point to where everybody else is doing these things that Screwtape is trying to get Wormwood's patient to do. It's meant for you to read and do a lot of self-reflection on your part and ask yourself if these are the kinds of things that are happening to you. So I want you to try and take what you find here and put it in application towards yourself. I think this is a good opportunity for me to explain to you here where I would disagree with C.S. Lewis on something. Well, I don't know if he actually believes this. Maybe this could just be part of the story. Just the whole premise of the book. Maybe he doesn't actually believe this. The idea that demons are actually running around as invisible entities tempting people. I personally don't believe that's what's happening. That's my belief. I think when I'm tempted because I'm a sinner. That's just the way it is. I don't think there's a demon actually trying to do what Wormwood is trying to get. What Wormwood's trying to do with his patient. But nevertheless, it's a great book. It's still a very good book. Really worth reading. So the premise of the book is, it's called the Screwtape Letters. The reason why it's called the Screwtape Letters is because each chapter is written as though it was a letter, an epistle that this demon named Screwtape is writing to his nephew, Wormwood. So at the beginning of every single letter, except one, at the beginning of every single letter, it always begins with "My dear Wormwood," because it's meant to be a letter. So now you don't see any of Wormwood's writings. All of this is Screwtape's writings. None of it is Wormwood's. So all you're reading is Screwtape responding to a presupposed Wormwood talking to his uncle, asking for advice on the quote-unquote patient. Now, what we know about the patient, we don't know his name. We just know it's a guy, probably in his 20s somewhere, something like that, living with his mother. I think it's significant that it's, by the way, that it's he's living with his mom. C.S. Lewis loved his mom, and his mom died when he was a little boy, and that really was tragic for him. That was traumatic for him all his life. And you'll notice in C.S. Lewis's writings that trauma kind of bleeds through in a lot of his writings, and I don't think it's any coincidence that he has a mother to the patient here. Now, the reason why is I think there's speculation. There's good reason to believe that C.S. Lewis, writing the Screwtape Letters, and you really, it's there. Each letter is really kind of like in a chronological order, even though I think he says in the beginning in the prologue they're not. But really, you can read it like a story from the eyes of Screwtape, of the story of this patient. He begins, of course, as an atheist. This patient. And the reason why you know that is because of letter number 1, which we're going to get into here in a moment. But you really see these. You can see a story between the patient developing. He begins as this atheist, which, by the way, that's kind of where C.S. Lewis was. Not a believer, anything like that. And then all of a sudden, he becomes a believer. And then now begins the long process, or the complicated process, you could say, of trying to get this patient to renounce his faith and go back into apostasy, in essence, or go into apostasy. There, that's a better word. So a lot of people have speculated that C.S. Lewis, the patient, is very reflective of C.S. Lewis's own life, his own journey, his own Christian journey. Now, I do truly believe, I'm not sure if that's necessarily true, but I do believe C.S. Lewis was absolutely drawing influence from his own experience as a Christian. I don't think it's possible for anybody to write the kinds of things that C.S. Lewis writes in this. Let me just say this. I don't think it's possible for anybody who calls himself a Christian to not have these experiences that you see in this book. And I'm pretty sure C.S. Lewis had these same experiences. I've had these same experiences, and I believe a vast majority of the Christians who watch this or listen to this have these experiences too. And it's one of the reasons why I want to do this. I think this book really helps to put perspective on our Christian journey. The ups and the downs and the kinds of things like that. So what I'm not going to read the book to you because I'm afraid I might get in trouble for that. But I am going to just basically kind of go through and talk about what each letter, the main points and the main thrust of each letter, and maybe a little bit of the context of some of the letters as well. The reason I want to do that is for your benefit, because I know when I first read this book, I was lost. It was just short of me reading The Abolition of Man, which is a really tough read. It's a small book, but that's a tough read. I look back now, I understand what C.S. Lewis is talking about now, but I know when I first started, it was not easy. And I always recommend people, especially this book, but it's not exactly an easy read. It's not Mere Christianity. It's not a very easy book to read. So I want you to read the book, but it's not easy to read. So how can I fix that? By trying to give you a layman's understanding of what each letter is about, so that if and when you do read the book, you got a good broad understanding of what the letter's about. And it'll just help you navigate it as your mind kind of puts it all together, kind of thing. At least that's what I hope to do. So, I think that's pretty much everything. The only other thing that I want you to remember, this is important. Remember, C.S. Lewis is writing during World War II, this book. It's either during or just a little bit after World War II, and I'm not exactly sure. That's when he's writing. So when he talks about the war, when we go into that, when I'm explaining the context, in other words, same thing you do with scripture. You do the context first and then the application. That's what we're going to do with this whole series. We're going to do the context and then make application. So he talks about the war. The war is World War II. I don't think they called it World War II back then. They just called it the war, the European War. Everybody knew what you meant when you were talking about the European War. So it was kind of a big deal. That's what he's talking about. And also, by the way, I think C.S. Lewis is writing around the time, at least the story itself takes place around the time during the London bombings, because there's going to be there's no evidence that the patient himself is actually is part of the British Army going overseas into Europe to go to war. He's still a civilian throughout the entire book, but you'll find out later on in the later parts of the book that bombings and things like that, and so I'm assuming that it has to do with the bombing of, or the Battle of London, or the Battle of Britain, I think is what it is, the Battle of Britain, in which London was bombed several times, and people were killed, obviously, and all that stuff. So that's probably where all that is about. So it's around that time that the story takes place. Now, that's just important to mention in terms of context. It's also important to remember that C.S. Lewis was an Anglican. So he's going to use a lot of language. I'm going to sort of explain a lot of it to you whenever that comes up. But he's going to use a lot of language that's just, liturgies and grocers and all this stuff. That's a lot of Anglican talk, sort of, Church of England stuff like that, because that's where C.S. Lewis was. That's the kind of denomination he belonged to. So that's just important to mention. So okay, so in letter 1, they're not titled. It's just 1, and then 2, the letter number 2. In letter 1, again, like I said, begins the story with the patient being basically an atheist. And I'll just read the beginning part. It says, "My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches." Now, by the way, enemy... when he says the enemy, he's talking about God, because, again, this is a demon. The enemy is God. So you're looking at things in the eyes of the antagonist. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing, and were prepared to alter their way of life as a result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. I love to just kind of do my own little Screwtape twist to it, so I apologize for that. But so obviously what we get from this is that apparently Wormwood is asking Screwtape for advice on how to keep his patient an atheist. Never believing, so that he dies an atheist and goes to hell. Now, the letter 1, again, this is just the first letter, and it already was a fascinating read. But the assumption by Wormwood, who is sort of a rookie, obviously, in this temptation business, and he thinks just just all I gotta do is just make sure he just reads works from materialists, or in other words, non-believers. That's all I gotta do, right? Just keep him reading those things and how they and all the natural sciences and stuff like that. Keep him there and all this kind of stuff like that. And all the arguments from my materialist friends, my non-believing friends, all their arguments against the existence of the supernatural, all of this stuff. That's all I got to do, right? Uncle Screwtape, right? So that's what Screwtape is responding to. He says, "I know what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend." But that's when he asks the question, "But are you not being a trifle naive?" And the next sentence, of course, it sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. I can pretty much quote it verbatim now without even looking at it. And the basic point here is that we're living in a sort of a postmodern era, or a modern era in C.S. Lewis's day, and then now we're living in a postmodern era, where the thinking of people is not the same as it used to be back in the old days. Back in before all this, people, as Screwtape says, I mean, there was a real meaning to what people thought and how they behaved about what they thought. Now we have these existential philosophies, and really a form of Gnosticism, if you kind of think about it, where we don't really, and the way I see it is, and I was thinking about this today, we're raised in this society to believe that my religion is over here, but everything else is over here. This is my personal religion, but when I go out in public, I have to be a neutral guy, a neutral somebody, and my religion and my religious beliefs have no bearing whatsoever on the way I actually live my life. There's just this separation of my worldview and the way I live my life. Now, of course, there really isn't. You're fooling yourself. Your worldview always dictates how you live your life. But see, that's how you're thinking. You're thinking in this way that's just completely contradictory. And he talks about that here. And so the result being is that you have people who have this sort of like, here's what I like to believe, but here's just the reality of the matter. And without really truly kind of pondering on these issues, especially today with all this flipping through our phones that we're doing with almost no reflection whatsoever upon our worldviews and things like that, it's inevitable that our society is filled with people who are more pragmatic in their thinking, and just whatever works, whatever's just kind of makes things happy and all that stuff for each and every one of us, all these kinds of things. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but the point here is in letter 1, Screwtape's he makes the argument that, well, not the argument, well, at least to Wormwood it is, that it's not by argument that you keep your patient out of the enemy's house and out of his light, but essentially it's just what Screwtape calls jargon, just all kinds of nothingness and just meaningless, all kinds of nice thoughts and pretty thoughts and all these kinds of things like that, about mankind and man's achievements and things like that. He says here, he doesn't, it quotes here, he doesn't think of, that is the patient, he doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. And so, in other words, it's the patient isn't thinking about what is absolutely true, because again, we're in a postmodern era. What absolute truth is pretty much out the window nowadays. So he's not thinking about what is truth. He's thinking about what's new, what's the progressive thing to believe in nowadays, and these kinds of things like that. That's what he's really thinking about. And he's thinking practically, pragmatically, and things like that. And then he goes on to say, jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think it is strong, or stark, or courageous, that it is the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about. And so the way Screwtape is telling Wormwood how to get his patient to keep him out of the enemy's clutches, as he says, is by just filling his mind with romantic ideas of materialism, not actually arguing for materialism, but a romantic idea of materialism, how it's the true evolution of man and things like that, all that kind of stuff. And he goes on to talk about this idea. So Screwtape will use an example of one of his own patients that he had once, and the man all of a sudden began to think, one day, about excuse me, he began to think all of a sudden about, and obviously his thinking was going in a direction, as Screwtape was able to understand. He was going in a direction that Screwtape didn't want him to go in. It was going in a direction that would eventually lead him to the enemy, or it could. He didn't know, but it was too risky. And he had been, Screwtape says he's been working on this guy for years and years and years to keep him out of the enemy's clutches, to keep him an atheist. All of a sudden, all of his work was about to go flying out the window. So Screwtape says in his example, it's in letter 1. Again, all this is in letter 1. Screwtape says that, if I had lost my head and began to try and defend against this rational line of thinking by argument, I should have messed up completely and been completely undone, and I would have lost him for sure. So the point is that basically what C.S. Lewis is getting at here is that true, rational, logical thinking, and I think C.S. Lewis is drawing from his own personal experience again here, but any kind of rational, logical thinking, clear thinking, always must lead you to the God of creation, the God of the universe, the God of the Bible. It always will. And so Screwtape recognizes that and realizes, I can't therefore allow my patient to actually be getting into the business of true, clear thinking. I've got to fill his head with a bunch of just stuff and just constantly just, again, application to us today. They didn't have phones back then, but, well, I mean, they had phones, click, that kind of stuff, and click, but not like ours, not these. These mini computers that happen to have a phone on them as well, a functioning phone. But how did I even get on that? But yeah. So our equivalent today would be just constantly just stuff, just all this stuff, and television and Netflix and movies and people going out and stuff like that. It's just the constant busyness of our everyday life. And that's what Screwtape does to make sure his patient doesn't go off into the enemy's territory, or God's territory, in other words. What he does is he puts in the mind of the guy to maybe he should get some lunch. He's feeling a little hungry. You're feeling a little hungry, man. You should go get some lunch, and then start really thinking about this stuff. Go get some lunch first. Get a nice, good meal, and then you can really just begin to think about the stuff. And the patient all of a sudden goes, "That's a good idea," and goes and gets lunch. And then he's walking around out this, I think, as a museum or something like that. So he walks out of the building, walks out into the street, and just sees a bus, a newsboy, just the normal everyday life thing like that, and eventually gets that sort of embrace of the normal life that he's living. He just goes, all that stuff about that's supernatural, whatnot. Just could not be true. Just because what Screwtape did was he filled his mind with ordinary life, and as long as all you're thinking about is just ordinary life, you just kind of go, all this crazy beyond this kind of stuff like that. It's just kind of silly because you're so used to the ordinary life kind of thing. You've never seen angels flying or anything like that, any supernatural events, just ordinary life. And so you're just convinced that all there is just ordinary life. And as long as you're just fixed on ordinary life, you're just the normal things that you do, your job, your kids, your wife, husband, lunch, and things like that. If that's all you're focused on, slowly, what could happen is the reality of God and the reality that all of this is a gift from Him begins to just sort of fade away and just further and further into the backdrop. That's kind of one of the warnings here. And to use an example, something that reminded me of this is one time a couple years ago, I was at work and my cousin was working with us. And I was sharing the gospel with him while we were working on a car together, and so we're both in the car, and I started talking about the gospel. I don't know exactly how I got there, but started talking about the gospel with him, and I could see he was thinking about it. He was just going, just Like, he never thought about that before. It was just, again, it was just a whole new, like, he's on a train of thought that if we're allowed to just keep going, who knows what could have happened. But then all of a sudden, my cousin, who used to work with us as well, my other cousin, I had two cousins working at the shop. One of them was just a regular employee. The other one was kind of like a medium boss, sort of like that, you know, like in between us and the bosses, in other words. My dad and my other boss. Anyway, so he comes down to give us some more stuff to do. And it's like, hey, Chase, Andrew, and so he calls our attention and starts giving us all these instructions, and then we have to go do this other stuff. And then as soon as he came down and began to say all that stuff, all that thinking from my other cousin that I just shared the gospel with, gone, just gone. And then he went back to his ordinary day, just work. And as far as I can tell, never thought about it ever again. Just drifted away. And that's basically what Screwtape gets his patient to do. Just keep his mind focused on his ordinary everyday life, so that he doesn't suddenly go off into the abstract, into the absolute truths, these kinds of things like that. And that's basically what you have here in letter number 1, to keep the patient's mind on the real life. Just and by real life he means newsboy, bus, all that stuff. That's just everyday life kind of stuff like that, keeping his mind focused on that. And so for us, what we want to think about is, am I so focused on the everyday life that I'm living? Just sort of, I wake up, eat breakfast, go to work, whatever, and go to school. Well, no one's going to school right now, but well, some people are, but anyways, go to school, whatever, get off of work, it's all tired, watch some Netflix before bed and stuff like that, and get up in the morning and do the same thing. Are you just going on this cycle of ordinary life, and it just sort of consumes you to the point that you never think about what your life means in the grand scheme of things, that you never really think and ponder about where you fit in God's universe, or who God is, even, is that something that happens to us? And I think that's one of the things that is important to get out of this. The other thing, of course, is that that's one of the ways we're kept constantly from pondering the true eternal things, is by constantly keeping our eyes focused on the temporal things. And there's going to be a lot more examples of that in the book here, but that's basically letter number 1. So that's letter number 1 in basically a nutshell, what you're going to read in letter number 1. So obviously the next one is letter number 2. So we're going to get that one in later installments, but for now, I hope this is all really useful to you. Just something to think about, and I hope you like it. It's kind of interesting, I think, at least. So to do. Glory, guys. God bless. I'll talk to you later. Bye.